Hey, what's up you guys? It's Nikki with Nikki Drafts, and today we're here for part 2 of the video where we make our own skirt blocks. Now, if you haven't watched part 1, I'm going to link it here for you, and that is going to be how to draft the skirt blocks using your own measurements. Today's video, we're going to be explaining how to sew them, fit them, and then how to correct the fit, so follow along. One more announcement before we start. I went ahead and made a Facebook group that coordinates with this YouTube channel called the Sewing and Drafting Collective. Name here, I will link it in the description, and that is a fun place for all creative thinkers to hang out, get feedback on projects, post design ideas, ask questions, tutorial suggestions, the whole 9 yards. It's a super fun, friendly, positive space, so you can join us again at the Sewing and Drafting Collective. So last week when we left off, we had finished our blocks and we're ready to cut out. I'm going to start by putting my front piece right on the fold. So you want to make sure it's right on top of your fold, and you want to pin each side of the fold. I don't like to pin up the center front because then you might have pin marks in your final garment, but for your block, it doesn't really matter. Make sure to pin all your corners and keep your pins parallel to the edge and within the seam allowance. You want to make sure those corners are pinned to ensure an accurate cut, and I like to throw a few pins in between for good measure as well. Now we have to pin our second piece. This is cut 2. So I'm going to be measuring from my selvage edge of my fabric to my grain line, making sure they are parallel, which means the same measurement. I spaced mine 12 inches away from the edge of my fabric. I'm going to pin one side and then measure and pin the other. This way our garment is hanging straight and we know the fit will be accurate. Again, pin all your corners and add some pins in between to ensure this isn't moving when you go to cut it out. It's really important that you're pinning without bunching the fabric so that it's a nice smooth finish and you can cut with precision, which will affect the way the garment is fitted. I have my fabric folded in half for 2 layers for this layout. If you guys are unsure what a selvage is or what a grain line is, I'm going to list in the description those definitions, and also I want to be uploading a video on how to put our fabric on grain, what the grain is, and everything about cutting fabric. Once it's pinned, it's time to cut them out. So grab your biggest, sharpest pair of fabric scissors. I'm trying to use the full length of my blade when I'm cutting, and I'm cutting away from myself to ensure smooth and accurate cuts. It's important that we're not cutting our seam allowance off or being inaccurate, or else we won't know if our pattern is fitting correctly. You want to use the floor to keep your hand steady, and you want to twist the scissors as we're cutting. So see here how I'm using the floor to guide my hand so it doesn't shake. And as I'm cutting curves, I'm twisting the scissors so I get a nice smooth cut instead of jaggedy edges. Next, you want to snip your notches. I just do a tiny 1/4 inch long little snip. I'm doing my dart legs. And then I also want to notch my center front. I do a little triangle for that so I can find the middle. Then I want to notch my hip line. This is going to help us line up all these important areas on our pattern so that we're not stretching while we sew. I'm also doing a double notch on the center back seam to help me differentiate. Taking a contrast color thread, I'm using orange. You want to go ahead and use a tailor tack to mark the end of the dart. You can use pencil or pen for this because this is just a prototype, but I like my thread markings. It just looks more neat. Leave a long tail going through all layers and snip. Now peel apart your layers gently, and you want to expose some of that thread so you still have some in one piece and some in this one, and trim. So we're separating so our thread's going through all the layers. See? Now both my darts are marked. Now I've already shown a tutorial on how to sew my darts, and I'm going to link that here for you guys. Also, you can check out the description for a link on how to sew darts. That's all included in my Dart Anatomy 101 and how to sew darts, so I will be linking that for you guys in the description. But mainly you want to make sure your darts are accurate and even so that they're both the same shape. Then we assemble. So we're going to put our side seams together, we're going to sew our center back seam together and only up to that bottom notch. So here I am starting at that double notch, back stitch, sew all the way down. Again, it's so important that your stitching is accurate and at your seam allowance. I've left 1/2 inch seam allowance for this block. So whatever seam allowance you chose to use, you have to make sure it's accurate. Press your seams open and flat. Again, we need to make sure this is accurate and smooth, or else we won't be able to tell if your block is fitting correctly. When I pin my seams, I always match my notches first, and then I'll pin the beginning and end. This way I'm not stretching the fabric out. Also, make sure you're pinning perpendicular to the seam. I see a lot of YouTubers showing how to pin and they pin parallel to the seam. This is not very good for sewing because you can't stitch over the pins. It's going to slow you down. You're more prone to stab yourself. So make sure that you are sewing perpendicular. You can take the pin out just before you stitch over it. You're not really supposed to sew over pins. I will sometimes, but do as I say, not as I do. Here is our finished block. So mine fits pretty well, except I'm having a little hollow area in between my hip and waist. This is normal. A lot of people do have this hollow section. So I'm gonna just carefully pin out my alteration. I'm not trying to make this too tight. Remember, this is a block for woven fabric, so don't overpin. So I'm just fitting this right to my figure. You might find it difficult to pin on yourself. That's okay. You can always call a friend for help. I was alone today, so I kind of just had to figure it out on my own. Just be careful not to poke yourself. Once you're done your pinning and made your adjustments, you want to go ahead and just move around in it, do a little squat test, do a sit test, make sure it's comfortable for movement. Now we have to move our alterations from our prototype to the pattern. I'm removing the pins and moving my seam allowance out of the way and then putting the pins back in so I can clearly see where I have to do the alterations. Then I'm going to trace them out with a marker or something dark that I can see, and I'm going to take out the pins and then smooth those lines out with my French curve. I really want to make sure these lines are nice and straight. So see how they're jaggedy? Grab your French curve and line it up so you can blend that back in. We don't want any points on this line. The side of your body isn't pointy, so make sure it's blending nice and smooth to avoid any weird puckers or dips. Now I'm going to measure my alterations, how wide they are in from my stitch line and how far down, and I'm going to transfer those alterations onto my pattern piece. Again, we're working from the stitch line, not the pattern edge. So I'm going to mark those in, measure how far down, and mark where it ends. And then doing the same technique, I'll end up blending this with my French curve as well to make sure that it's the same shaping and that it's nice and smooth. Now that my blending is done, I'm going to add seam allowance to my new alteration line. I've done these in a different color so that I don't get confused and I can see the difference between my old line and my newly altered line. Finish adding your seam allowance. Then cut off the excess. Place the back on top, and you want to line up your sewing line, not the seam allowance line, and trace out your alteration. The front and back might be a slightly different shape, so you're going to have to walk the piece along as you trace. See how I'm twisting a little bit? Then blend again with your French curve. This way we know we took the exact same amount in on the front and back and we don't have an imbalance in the seam. Add your seam allowance and then cut just like you did for the front, and then you have a fully functioning, finished, altered block. See, that was easy. So we went ahead, we made our skirt blocks. Now you have a perfectly fitted skirt block custom to your measurements. And we're going to be using this blocks for all sorts of fun projects on the channel. So starting next week, we are going to be drafting all sorts of cool skirts. Think pockets, think fly front zippers, think ruffles, flares, fitted, you name it. So I'm going to be showing you guys how to actually use these blocks now to create custom garments that fit. And because your block fits and you're starting with a foundation of something that already fits properly, your garments are going to turn out a lot better and more professional because there's less corrections later if you start with a good block. So make sure you do your fitting, make sure you draft those blocks, and I'll see you guys next time.